a Russian count who owned nearly 4,000 acres of land, thousands of serfs, and unimaginable wealth, abandoned it all at age 82, fleeing his estate in the middle of the night like a fugitive. 10 days later, he died in a railway station master's house, refused entry to his own home by the wife he'd been married to for 48 years. This was Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, a man who wrote two of the greatest novels in human history, and then spent the final 30 years of his life trying to destroy the literary legacy that made him immortal. The story begins not with triumph, but with absence. Tolstoy was born on August 28, 1828, at Yasnaya Polyana, the family estate about 130 miles south of Moscow. The name means clear glade, a sprawling property of birch forests, apple orchards, and fields stretching to the horizon. It was paradise for a child, but Lev's paradise was haunted from the beginning. His mother died when he was not yet 2 years old. He had no memory of her face, no recollection of her voice. Throughout his life, he would write about this absence with an ache that never healed. He kept a portrait of her, studied it obsessively, tried to conjure her from the painted features. The loss carved something hollow in him, a void he would spend 8 decades trying to fill with philosophy, religion, literature, and ultimately a spiritual quest that consumed everything. His father, Count Nikolai Tolstoy, tried to hold the family together. There were 5 children: Nikolai, Sergei, Dmitri, Lev, and a sister, Maria. The household was aristocratic but warm, filled with tutors, servants, games in the forest, and elaborate childhood rituals. The boys invented a secret society dedicated to universal love and brotherhood. They called themselves the Ant Brothers, a mistranslation of Moravian brothers they'd heard about. The idea was simple, but profound. Somewhere written on a green stick buried in the forest was the secret to making all people happy and eliminating evil forever. Lev never stopped searching for that green stick. When he was 9, his father died suddenly. The estate passed to a distant aunt, who became the children's guardian. The family structure, already fragile, shattered completely. Lev and his siblings were sent to Kazan to live with another aunt. The boy who had roamed freely through forests and fields was now trapped in a provincial city, surrounded by the suffocating conventions of aristocratic society. He hated it. Adolescence hit Tolstoy like a runaway train. He was awkward, physically unattractive by his own brutal assessment. His nose was too large, his ears stuck out, his features seemed assembled without harmony. In his diary, which he started at 18 and maintained obsessively for the rest of his life, he catalogued his flaws with merciless precision. Vanity, laziness, indecision, cowardice, lying. He created elaborate rules for self-improvement. Wake at 5, exercise, study languages, avoid gambling, control lustful thoughts. He broke every single rule. At 16, he enrolled at Kazan University to study Oriental languages, then switched to law. He was a disastrous student. Bored by lectures, contemptuous of professors, he skipped classes to read Rousseau, Voltaire, and philosophical texts that had nothing to do with his coursework. His mind was brilliant but undisciplined, ricocheting between obsessions. One week he'd commit to mastering 12 languages. The next he'd decide physical strength mattered more and design a punishing gymnastics regimen he'd abandon after 3 days. The contradiction defined him. Intellectually, he craved purity, discipline, moral perfection. Physically, he was ruled by appetites he despised but couldn't control. He left university without graduating in 1847, returning to Yasnaya Polyana with vague plans to become a model landowner, to improve the lives of his serfs through enlightened management. He was 19, idealistic, convinced he could revolutionize Russian agriculture through sheer force of moral conviction. The serfs wanted nothing to do with his schemes. He tried to build them a hospital. They were suspicious. He attempted to introduce modern farming techniques. They resisted. His grand vision of benevolent paternalism crashed against the reality that the people whose lives he wanted to improve didn't trust the motives of a teenage aristocrat who'd never worked a day in his life. Within months, the experiment collapsed, so he went to Moscow. The city devoured him. Gambling consumed entire nights. He lost staggering sums at cards, then won them back, then lost double. He visited brothels, drank heavily, pursued women with the same chaotic energy he applied to everything else. His diaries from this period are exercises in self-loathing. I am disgusting, I am weak, I am contemptible. Yet the next entry would describe the same behaviours, repeated with only slightly more guilt attached. His older brother Nikolai, watching this spiral, made a suggestion. Join the army. Get out of Moscow before you destroy yourself completely. In 1851, Lev travelled to the Caucasus, the wild mountainous frontier, where Russia was fighting a brutal colonial war against Muslim tribesmen. He didn't enlist immediately. For months he simply lived there, hunting, drinking, gambling with officers, watching the strange violent beauty of a war zone. He was fascinated and appalled. When he finally joined up as a junker, a volunteer awaiting commission, military life gave him what civilian life never had: structure. The army operated on clear rules: follow orders, show courage under fire, accept the hierarchy. It was liberating in its simplicity, but it was also his first sustained encounter with death. In the Caucasus, people killed each other over land, honour, religion, and sometimes nothing at all. Tolstoy watched men die. He participated in raids on Chechen villages. He saw the burned homes, the widows, the children orphaned by wars they didn't understand. Something shifted. The romantic notions about military glory began curdling into questions he couldn't suppress. Yet he also discovered he could write. Stationed in a small fort with long stretches of boredom between skirmishes, Tolstoy began working on a manuscript. Childhood, a semi-autobiographical novella, poured out of him. The prose was fresh, psychologically intricate, unsentimental. He wrote about the inner life of a boy navigating love, shame, confusion, and loss. When he sent the manuscript to a prominent literary journal in St. Petersburg, he expected rejection. It was published in 1852 to immediate acclaim. At 24, Lev Tolstoy was a literary sensation. Critics praised the emotional honesty, the precision of observation, the way he captured the texture of consciousness itself. Here was a new voice, distinctly Russian, unafraid of complexity. He followed it with boyhood and then youth, completing a trilogy that established him as one of the most promising writers of his generation. But he wasn't in St. Petersburg enjoying his success. He was still in uniform, transferring to Sevastopol when the Crimean War erupted in 1853. Sevastopol was hell. The city, besieged by British, French, and Ottoman forces, became a meat grinder. Tolstoy served in the 4th Bastion, one of the most dangerous positions, enduring months of constant bombardment. Soldiers lived underground in bunkers, emerging only to fight or die. The scale of slaughter was industrial, impersonal, obscene. He kept writing. His Sevastopol sketches, published serially during the war, were unlike any war literature that had come before. He didn't glorify battle. He showed it as chaos, stupidity, waste, officers incompetent, soldiers brave and doomed, strategy non-existent. The sketches were so honest, so damning, that military censors softened them before publication. Even censored, they made an impact. Tsar Alexander II read them and reportedly said, "Guard this man's life." Whether the story is true or not, Tolstoy survived the siege and left the army in 1856 with the rank of lieutenant and a reputation as both a war hero and a dangerous truth-teller. He returned to St. Petersburg a celebrity. The literary elite welcomed him into their circle. Ivan Turgenev, already an established giant of Russian literature, befriended him. Salons opened their doors. Publishers competed for his work. Beautiful, intelligent women flirted with him at parties. He hated all of it. The artificiality repulsed him. Writers sitting around discussing literature while peasants starved. Intellectuals debating revolution in comfortable drawing rooms. Everyone performing sophistication. Nobody doing anything real. His contempt was visible, his manners abrasive. He picked fights, mocked fellow writers, questioned their integrity. With Turgenev, the friendship curdled into mutual loathing. During a visit to Turgenev's estate, an argument about how Turgenev's daughter was being raised escalated into Tolstoy accusing Turgenev of moral hypocrisy. Turgenev responded with an insult. Tolstoy challenged him to a duel. They nearly killed each other over a disagreement about child rearing before mutual friends intervened. The rift lasted 17 years. In 1857, Tolstoy fled Russia entirely, travelling through Europe. Paris disgusted him. The execution by guillotine he witnessed in the street haunted him for years. Geneva bored him. The casinos of Baden-Baden seduced and bankrupted him. He returned home more confused than when he'd left, convinced that European civilization was a rotting corpse, but unsure what should replace it. Back at Yasnaya Polyana, he threw himself into education. He opened a school for peasant children on his estate, teaching them himself. No textbooks, no rote memorization, no corporal punishment. Students could leave whenever they wanted. Lessons followed curiosity rather than curriculum. It was radical, chaotic, probably ineffective by any measurable standard. He loved it. For a brief period, Tolstoy believed education was the answer, not revolution, not reform, but simply teaching children to think freely. He started a pedagogical journal, wrote essays on educational philosophy, argued with other reformers who thought his methods too anarchic. Then he met Sophia Andreevna Bears. She was 16, he was 34. She was the daughter of a court physician, well-educated, artistic, full of youthful enthusiasm for literature and life. He was a famous writer, a war veteran, a man who'd lived 1,000 lives already. When he visited the Bears family estate in the summer of 1862, something clicked. Within weeks he proposed. Sophia, called Sonia by family, accepted. The age gap was enormous, the power imbalance troubling by modern standards. But in aristocratic Russia of the 1860s, it was unremarkable. What was remarkable was Tolstoy's decision to show Sonia his diaries before the wedding. Every detail of his past, the gambling, the brothels, the affairs, the illegitimate child he'd fathered with a peasant woman on his estate. He wanted complete honesty, no secrets between them. It traumatized her. She read about his sexual exploits, his moral failures, his contempt for himself and others. She was 16 and sheltered. He handed her a catalogue of depravity and called it honesty. Years later, she would say that reading those diaries poisoned their marriage before it began, planting images and jealousies that never left her mind. They married on September 23rd, 1862, in the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin in the Kremlin. Sonia wore white. Tolstoy wore his old military uniform. They returned to Yasnaya Polyana to begin their life together. The first years were happy, or at least productive. Sonia managed the estate with fierce efficiency, while Tolstoy disappeared into his study for hours each day. She copied his manuscripts in her beautiful handwriting, deciphering his chaotic drafts, offering edits. She bore children rapidly, 13 in total, though only 8 would survive to adulthood. And Tolstoy began writing a novel about Napoleon's invasion of Russia. What emerged would consume 7 years of his life and change literature forever. But in those early days of marriage, as Sonia's pen scratched across pages late into the night, copying her husband's sprawling historical epic, neither of them could have known that the book taking shape would eventually stand between them like an impassable wall, a monument to the man Tolstoy was before the transformation that would tear their family apart. War and Peace began as a novel about the Decembrists, those aristocratic revolutionaries who'd attempted a coup in 1825. Tolstoy wanted to write about a man returning from Siberian exile 30 years later, looking back on what had driven him to rebellion. But the more he researched, the further back he went. To understand the Decembrists, he needed to understand the generation that fought Napoleon. To understand that generation, he needed to understand 1812. Before he knew it, he was writing about the French invasion itself, and the Decembrists were forgotten. The manuscript sprawled. Hundreds of characters, multiple plot lines, enormous battle scenes, philosophical digressions about the nature of history and free will. Publishers were baffled. Readers in literary journals got advanced sections and complained about the lack of structure. This wasn't a novel in any recognizable sense. It had no single protagonist, no clear plot arc. Tolstoy didn't care. He was trying to capture something true about human experience, about how history actually feels from inside it, about the gap between what people plan and what actually happens. The first sections appeared in print in 1865 in the Russian Messenger. By 1867, as more installments published, the reading public began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a historical novel, it was an entire world recreated on the page. Pierre Bezukhov, the awkward intellectual searching for meaning, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, the aristocrat seeking glory and finding disillusionment, Natasha Rostova, young and alive and changing before the reader's eyes. These characters felt real in a way fictional characters rarely did. They contradicted themselves, made terrible decisions, grew and regressed and grew again. The battle scenes were unlike anything in literature. Not heroic or cleanly choreographed, but chaotic, confused, terrifying. Soldiers had no idea what was happening. Generals issued orders that made no difference. Napoleon's strategic genius, Tolstoy argued, was a myth. History wasn't made by great men. It was made by a million small actions, most of them unplanned. This philosophy, woven throughout the novel, infuriated critics. Turgenev called it a mess. Professional historians dismissed Tolstoy's theories as naive, but readers kept reading. When the final volume appeared in 1869, War and Peace was recognized as something unprecedented. Not the greatest Russian novel, because Russia had never seen anything like it. Not the greatest war novel, because it was also a domestic epic. It was simply War and Peace, its own category. Sonia had copied every word, sometimes 7 or 8 drafts of the same scene. She was pregnant through much of it, nursing infants while transcribing battle descriptions. The work was grueling, but in those years she felt essential. She was his partner in the truest sense, not just bearing his children, but helping birth his masterpiece. Tolstoy dedicated the book to her, though the dedication was removed in later editions. Tie-ins. The success should have satisfied him. He was 41 years old, wealthy, famous, the father of a growing family, the author of a novel that would endure for centuries. Instead, he grew restless. War and Peace had been about history, about public events and private lives intersecting across a vast canvas. His next novel would be smaller, more focused, more painful. It would be about a woman destroyed by society for wanting what men took freely. In 1870, Tolstoy read a newspaper account of a woman named Anna Stepanova Pirogova who'd thrown herself under a train. She'd been the mistress of a neighbouring landowner, discarded when he tired of her. The image haunted him. A woman on the tracks, that moment of decision. He began sketching scenes, trying to understand what would drive someone to that point. Anna Karenina emerged slowly. He'd write a section, abandon it for months, return with a completely different approach. The opening line came after dozens of attempts. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It's one of the most famous sentences in literature. though its truth is debatable. What matters is that Tolstoy believed it. He was thinking about his own family, about Sonia, about the cracks forming in their happiness. Anna Arkadyevna Karenina walks into the novel as a sophisticated Petersburg socialite, married to a high-ranking government official. She meets Count Vronsky at a train station. The affair that follows destroys her life, not because the love is false, but because society permits men their passions while punishing women for the same. Tolstoy gave Anna his own intensity, his own hunger for something authentic in a world of performance and propriety. He also gave her no way out, parallel to Anna's. Story runs Konstantin Levin's, a character so transparently autobiographical that readers immediately recognized Tolstoy himself. Levin struggles with faith, with the meaning of his work, with his place among both peasants and aristocrats. He finds happiness in marriage to Kitty, in farming, in simple labour, but the happiness is fragile, always shadowed by questions he can't answer. The novel took 7 years. Serialization began in The Russian Messenger in 1875, but Tolstoy kept revising, kept pushing publication back, kept rewriting sections that were already in print. The editor begged him to finish. Sonia copied manuscript pages until her hand cramped, raising children during the day, transcribing at night. Their 8th child was born during the writing. Their 7th had died in infancy. The grief soaked into the novel. When Anna throws herself under the train in the novel's climax, the description is brutal, precise, unsparing. Tolstoy didn't romanticize her death. It was ugly, violent, final. Some readers were appalled. Others recognized the moral courage of refusing to make tragedy beautiful. The novel was published in full in 1878. Critical reception was mixed, but the public devoured it. Anna Karenina became the book everyone read, discussed, argued about. Was Anna a victim or responsible for her fate? Was her suicide inevitable or a choice? The debates raged in salons and journals. Tolstoy barely noticed. By the time Anna Karenina was finished, he was in the midst of a psychological and spiritual collapse that would change everything. He'd spent years writing about characters searching for meaning. Now he couldn't avoid the question himself. What was his life for? He had wealth beyond measure, a large family, international fame, 2 novels that would define Russian literature, and he wanted to die. The crisis hit him around 1879, just after Anna Karenina's completion. He was 51 years old. He'd later describe it in a confession, written between 1879 and 1880, though not published until 1882. The text is stark, terrifying in its honesty. He wrote about hiding ropes so he wouldn't hang himself, about avoiding hunting rifles for fear he'd put the barrel in his mouth. This wasn't depression in the modern clinical sense, though it certainly included that. It was existential collapse. Every answer he'd ever accepted about life's purpose crumbled under examination. Work. He'd accomplished more than most writers dream of. Family. He loved his children, but they would die, and what then? Fame, meaningless. Art, just arranging words on paper while the void waited. The question that destroyed him was simple. Why live if death erases everything? He could find no rational answer. Science offered none. Philosophy offered clever evasions. Art was distraction. The peasants on his estate, illiterate and poor, seemed to have something he lacked. They believed in God without question, accepted their suffering, worked without existential panic. Their faith was simple, unexamined, possibly ignorant, but it gave them what his education and wealth couldn't provide: a reason to continue. Tolstoy began a desperate investigation of religion, not the orthodox Christianity of his childhood, which he'd dismissed decades earlier as superstition and ritual. He went to the sources, the Gospels, read in Greek, the Church Fathers, theological commentaries, Buddhist texts, Islamic philosophy. He approached faith like a prosecuting attorney, demanding evidence, tearing apart contradictions, refusing easy comfort. What he found in the Gospels, stripped of church interpretation, was revolutionary. Jesus' teachings, Tolstoy concluded, were not about ritual or afterlife rewards. They were about how to live now. The Sermon on the Mount contained 5 specific commandments. Do not be angry, do not lust, do not swear oaths, do not resist evil with violence, love your enemies. These weren't suggestions. They were the path to the kingdom of God, which wasn't a place you go when you die, but a state of being you enter by living correctly. The implications were staggering. If you took Jesus seriously, actually seriously, you had to reject almost everything civilization was built on. Courts and laws depended on oaths and punishment. Governments required violence or its threat. Property required defense. Marriage as practiced required ownership of another person. The Orthodox Church blessed armies, crowned czars, owned vast wealth. It had nothing to do with what Jesus taught. Tolstoy's reading radicalized him utterly. He announced that he was now a Christian, but in doing so rejected the church, the sacraments, the clergy, everything official Christianity represented. The Russian Orthodox Church was not amused. His family was horrified. Sonia watched her husband transform into someone she didn't recognize. The man who'd written War and Peace, who'd captured the complexity of human nature with such nuance, now spoke in absolutes. Meat-eating was murder. Private property was theft. Sex, even in marriage, was sinful unless for procreation. Art that didn't serve moral instruction was worthless, which meant most of his own work was worthless. He wanted to give away the estate, renounce his copyrights, live like a peasant. Sonia refused. She had children to raise, a household to manage. They fought viciously, long battles that left both of them exhausted and unchanged. He called her materialistic, a slave to comfort. She called him a hypocrite, preaching poverty while she did the actual work of keeping the family fed. Both were right. Tolstoy published a confession in 1882, though it was immediately banned in Russia. Copies circulated illegally. He followed it with What I Believe in 1884, laying out his interpretation of Christianity in systematic detail. The church and the state are evil institutions. Violence is always wrong. Property is theft. Simple living is the only moral life. These weren't metaphors. He meant them literally. Disciples began arriving at Yasnaya Polyana. Seekers, idealists, anarchists, people who'd read his religious writings and wanted to learn from the master. Tolstoy welcomed them, spent hours in conversation, encouraged them to start communes based on Christian anarchist principles. Sonia called them parasites and resented every moment her husband gave them. The estate became a circus. Tolstoy dressed in peasant clothes he'd sewn himself, badly. He made his own boots. He worked in the fields, though the peasants found this embarrassing and awkward. A count pretending to be one of them helped nobody. He gave away money to anyone who asked, which meant a constant stream of beggars and con artists. Sonia tried to manage the finances, while her husband undermined her at every turn. Their intimate life collapsed. Tolstoy believed sex was sinful. He'd written an entire novel, The Kreutzer Sonata, published in 1889, arguing that marriage was legalized prostitution and that true Christians should be celibate. The main character murders his wife in a jealous rage, then delivers a monologue about how sexual desire destroys everything good in human relations. Sonia had to copy that manuscript too, writing out her husband's arguments for why their marriage was fundamentally immoral. She was 45 years old, exhausted from bearing 13 children, and now being told that the physical intimacy of their marriage had been sinful all along. The bitterness was corrosive. Yet Tolstoy's international fame grew beyond anything he'd achieved with his novels. His religious and political writings were translated worldwide. In America, Tolstoy clubs formed. In England, His essays on nonviolence influenced emerging pacifist movements. In India, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi read The Kingdom of God is Within You and found the philosophical foundation for what would become Satyagraha. Tolstoy had become a prophet, whether he wanted the role or not. The problem with becoming a prophet is that prophets rarely get to control what happens next. By the 1890s, Tolstoy's ideas had escaped him entirely, taken up by groups he'd never met, interpreted in ways he never intended, used to justify actions he would have condemned. Some disciples took his teaching seriously, perhaps too seriously. They formed agricultural communes based on Christian anarchist principles, attempting to live without private property or government authority. Most collapsed within months. Turns out shared farming requires more than moral conviction. It requires people who actually know how to farm and who can tolerate each other through winter. Others turned Tolstoy's pacifism into a cudgel. They refused military service and were arrested, beaten, exiled to Siberia. Tolstoy wrote letters on their behalf, appealed to the Tsar, published essays condemning their persecution. The government ignored him. His fame protected him personally. They wouldn't dare arrest Count Tolstoy, but his followers enjoyed no such immunity. He felt responsible for their suffering. He'd given them ideas. They'd paid the price. Then there were the frauds, the opportunists who attached themselves to any fashionable cause. Yasnaya Polyana attracted freeloaders who spoke beautifully about simple living while eating Sonia's food and sleeping in her guest rooms. Tolstoy, desperate for genuine connection with people who understood his vision, couldn't always distinguish between sincere seekers and skilled manipulators. Sonia could. She watched them come and go, despising most of them, especially the ones her husband trusted most. One man in particular, Vladimir Chertkov, became the source of the marriage's final disintegration. Chertkov was a former guards officer from an aristocratic family who'd converted to Tolstoy's teachings in the 1880s. He was intelligent, organised, utterly devoted to the master, and he saw himself as the guardian of Tolstoy's legacy. He established a publishing house for Tolstoy's religious writings, the ones banned in Russia, printing them abroad and smuggling them back. He managed correspondence, filtered visitors, made himself indispensable. Sonia hated him. She saw correctly that Chertkov was trying to separate Tolstoy from his family, to claim him entirely for the cause. Chertkov saw Sonia as the obstacle, the materialistic wife who kept the great man chained to property and convention. Both were fighting for Tolstoy's soul, and the old man was caught between them, pulled apart by competing loyalties. The battle focused on Tolstoy's will. Chertkov argued that Tolstoy should renounce copyright on all his works, making them public domain, available to anyone without payment. This was consistent with Tolstoy's principles. Private property was wrong. Art should belong to humanity. Sonia argued that she'd raised his children, managed his affairs for 40 years, copied every manuscript. The copyrights were her security, her children's inheritance. Taking them away would leave the family destitute after his death. Tolstoy was paralyzed. His principles demanded he renounce everything. His guilt and residual love for Sonia made him hesitate. For years he did nothing, the question hanging over the household like smoke. Chertkov pushed constantly, framing it as a test of Tolstoy's sincerity. Sonia pushed back, framing it as betrayal. In 1910, Tolstoy was 82 years old. His health was failing. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Sonia, convinced Chertkov was stealing her husband, became obsessed with finding documents, searching Tolstoy's study at night, reading his diary, interrogating him about every conversation. She'd suffered what we'd now recognize as a nervous breakdown. Tolstoy felt hunted in his own home. He wrote in his diary, hidden from Sonia, that living with her had become impossible. She found the diary and read that entry. The wound went deeper. On the night of October 28, 1910, Tolstoy woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of rustling paper. Sonia was in his study again, searching through his things. Something snapped. He couldn't do this anymore. He woke his doctor, Dusan Makovitsky, a disciple who lived on the estate. He told him they were leaving. Now, in the middle of the night, they packed quickly. Tolstoy took almost nothing. A few clothes, some books. They woke a servant, ordered a carriage to the station, and left Yasnaya Polyana in darkness. Tolstoy was abandoning his wife, his home, everything he'd known for 60 years. He was finally, at 82, living his principles. No property, no comfort, no compromise, just the open road and whatever came next. He had no plan. He thought perhaps he'd go to his sister at a convent, or maybe just wander, live as a pilgrim. He wrote Sonia a letter explaining his decision, asking her not to follow, telling her he couldn't live with the luxury and pretense anymore. He mailed it from the first station. Then he and Makovitsky boarded a train heading south. Sonia found the letter the next morning. She ran to the pond and tried to drown herself. Servants pulled her out. She attempted it again later that day. Her children, arriving at the estate in response to telegrams, restrained her, got doctors. She was hysterical, destroyed. Whatever anger and resentment had built up over decades, she'd never imagined he'd actually leave. The press found out within hours. Tolstoy's flight became an international sensation. Reporters tracked his movements, telegraphed updates. The great author had abandoned his family. Was it madness? Principle? Where was he going? Speculation filled newspapers across Europe and America. Tolstoy made it as far as Ostapovo, a tiny railway station in the middle of nowhere. On the train, he'd developed a fever. By the time they arrived, he was seriously ill. The station master, a man named Ivan Ozolin, offered his small house. They carried Tolstoy inside, put him to bed in a cramped room, barely bigger than a closet. Pneumonia. At his age, it was almost certainly fatal. Word spread. Disciples rushed to Ostapovo. Journalists descended on the village, dozens of them, setting up camp near the station, waiting. Chertkov arrived and took control, managing access to the dying man, deciding who could enter and when. And Sonia came, frantic, desperate to see her husband one last time. Chertkov wouldn't let her in. He claimed Tolstoy didn't want to see her, that the shock might kill him. She waited outside the station master's house, sometimes allowed to look through the window at the man she'd been married to for 48 years, dying in a stranger's bed. For 7 days, Tolstoy drifted in and out of consciousness. Doctors came from Moscow. His children arrived. The world waited for news. Reporters filed daily updates. The vigil at Ostapovo became one of the first modern media circuses. Cameras and telegraph wires, and crowds of onlookers watching a man die. On November 7th, 1910, just after 6 in the morning, Tolstoy woke briefly, looked at his daughter Alexandra, and said something about escape. How millions of people suffer, but he couldn't understand why. Then he lost consciousness. His breathing slowed. At 6:05 a.m., he died. Sonia was finally allowed into the room. She kissed his body, apologized, wept. Whether he'd forgiven her or she'd forgiven him, no one could say. The marriage had ended in mutual wreckage. They buried him at Yasnaya Polyana, in the forest where he'd played as a child, near the spot where his brother Nikolai had told him the secret of universal love was written on a green stick. No priest, no religious ceremony, just family, peasants, disciples. Thousands came to pay respects. The funeral was silent except for the sound of dirt falling on wood. Tolstoy had spent the last 30 years of his life trying to escape the contradiction of being a wealthy aristocrat preaching poverty. He never managed it. He died owning nothing but famous for everything, estranged from his wife but surrounded by followers, finally free of property but trapped by his own legend. The man who'd written that all happy families are alike had presided over one of the most unhappy families in literary history. But here's what's strange. The ideas survived the chaos. Tolstoy's religious writings, the essays that caused all the family anguish, the principles that destroyed his marriage. They went out into the world and did things he never witnessed. Gandhi read them in South Africa and developed nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. read Gandhi, traced the lineage back to Tolstoy, built the American civil rights movement on principles this Russian aristocrat had articulated in his study. The Catholic worker movement, Christian anarchism, pacifist philosophy, all of it carries Tolstoyan DNA. Dorothy Day, founding the Catholic worker houses that still serve the poor across America, kept a copy of Tolstoy's essays. She'd read them as a young journalist and they'd changed her. The Sermon on the Mount taken literally, practiced absolutely. That was Tolstoy's gift, if you can call it that. He made radical Christianity seem possible, even necessary. Wittgenstein read him, converted to something like mysticism. Hofstadter traced patterns of thought back to Tolstoyan skepticism about rational systems. Iris Murdoch built her moral philosophy, partially, on Tolstoyan attention to the real. The influence spreads like roots underground, invisible but structural. Meanwhile, the fiction endured separately. War and Peace and Anna Karenina became not just Russian classics, but world literature, translated into every major language, assigned in schools, adapted for stage and screen dozens of times. The books Tolstoy later dismissed as worthless, the art he'd created before his conversion, turned out to be immortal. The religious tracts he considered his real work, mostly forgotten except by specialists. There's irony there. The things he valued most mattered least. The things he'd abandoned were what lasted. Although, maybe that's not quite right either. Maybe both versions of Tolstoy, the artist and the prophet, the novelist and the anarchist, were necessary. Maybe you can't separate them cleanly. The same man who saw into Anna Karenina's heart wrote the essays that inspired Gandhi. The psychological insight and the moral absolutism came from the same source. Virginia Woolf said the novel was dead after Tolstoy. How could anyone write after War and Peace? The form had been perfected. She was wrong about the novel dying, but right about the perfection. No one has written a better novel. People keep trying, and they should, but they're all writing in Tolstoy's shadow. Thomas Mann called him the greatest artist of all time. Nabokov, who hated almost everyone, admitted Tolstoy was untouchable. Even people who find his moralizing insufferable, who reject everything about his late religious phase, they still bow to the novels. You can argue with Tolstoy the prophet. You can't argue with Tolstoy the artist. So what do we do with him? This man who wrote the most life-affirming fiction in Russian literature, then spent 30 years saying life wasn't worth affirming unless you gave up everything comfortable about it. Who loved his wife and made her miserable? Who preached non-violence while his words helped topple empires? Who died fleeing the consequences of his own contradictions? Maybe we accept the contradiction. Maybe that's the point. Tolstoy never resolved it, and we won't either. The tension between art and morality, between family and principle, between the world as it is and the world as it should be, that's permanent. He just lived it more intensely than most people can stand. His grave has no marker, no inscription, just a mound of earth in the forest. People still visit, leave flowers, stand silently. They're paying respects to both versions of the man, the novelist and the prophet, the artist who captured life, and the moralist who rejected it. The contradiction buried in the ground at Yasnaya Polyana, unresolved, still somehow generative. But before the grave, before the final flight, there were 30 years of living the contradiction, trying to be a saint while still being human. The 1880s and 90s were Tolstoy's prophetic period, and they were chaos. He'd given up meat, alcohol, tobacco, hunting. He dressed in peasant clothing, made his own boots, worked in the fields. At 60 years old, he was hauling water, chopping wood, ploughing. the aristocrat performing manual labour while actual peasants watched bemused. Some thought he was holy, others thought he'd lost his mind. He renounced copyright to all his works published after his conversion. Anyone could print them, translate them, sell them. No permission needed. Sophia, still managing the family finances, was horrified. They had 13 children, most still living at home. How were they supposed to survive? The answer, according to Tolstoy, was that they should give away everything and live simply. Sophia's answer was that he could live in a hut if he wanted, but she wasn't letting her children starve for his principles. The battle lines were drawn. She kept control of the early works, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, the ones that actually made money. Those copyrights she refused to surrender. Tolstoy, who'd renounced private property, now watched his wife profit from his art, while he gave away his religious writings for free. Another contradiction he couldn't escape. The house at Yasnaya Polyana became a pilgrimage site. Disciples arrived constantly, begging for guidance. They wanted to learn how to live righteously, to hear the great man explain the path to salvation. Tolstoy, who'd written that spiritual teachers were frauds and you should trust only your own conscience, found himself surrounded by followers, treating him like a guru. Some moved onto the estate permanently. They'd build huts on his land, work in his fields, gather for readings and discussions. Sophia hated them. They were freeloaders and fanatics, and they encouraged her husband's worst impulses. The Tolstoyans, they called themselves, a sect forming around a man who insisted there should be no sects. Chertkov was the worst of them. Vladimir Chertkov, a former guards officer who'd become Tolstoy's most devoted disciple and most controlling advisor. He managed Tolstoy's religious publishing, organized his followers, and slowly positioned himself as the intermediary between the master and the world. Sophia saw him as a manipulator, a cult leader hiding behind her husband's name. Tolstoy saw him as his truest friend, the only one who truly understood. The rivalry between Sophia and Chertkov poisoned everything. They competed for Tolstoy's attention, his approval, control over his legacy. Both claimed to love him. Both made his life unbearable. Meanwhile, the Russian government was watching. Tolstoy's writings were technically illegal, banned for their anarchist content and criticism of the church, but he was too famous to arrest. Tolstoy had become an international figure, more celebrated abroad than in Russia. Arresting him would cause an international scandal, so they settled for harassment, censoring his works, exiling his followers, making sure he knew he was tolerated, not accepted. In 1901, the Holy Synod officially excommunicated him. They'd wanted to for years, but waited until they had sufficient public support. The decree was blunt. Tolstoy had rejected the divinity of Christ, the resurrection, the sacraments, everything the church stood for. He was declared outside the faith. The response was massive. Thousands of letters poured in supporting him, condemning the church. Demonstrations erupted. The government worried about riots. Tolstoy had become a martyr, which was exactly what he'd wanted to avoid. He issued a response, calm and measured, saying he'd left the church long ago and the excommunication changed nothing. But privately, he was pleased. The institution had confirmed what he'd been saying all along. It was corrupt, and he was free of it. His health was failing. He'd always been robust, almost unnaturally strong. But age and stress were catching up. He suffered a serious illness in 1901, nearly died. Recovered, then relapsed. His doctors ordered rest. He ignored them. There was too much work to do, too much writing, too many people needing guidance. The visits continued. Maxim Gorky came, the young writer who'd grown up in poverty and now represented the new generation of Russian realism. They talked for hours. Gorky left shaken, writing that Tolstoy was both more and less than human, a man trying to be God and failing beautifully. Anton Chekhov visited, the playwright and short story master. He admired Tolstoy's fiction, but found his moralizing exhausting. After one visit, he wrote to a friend, that talking to Tolstoy about religion was like talking to a brick wall. A brilliant, articulate brick wall, but immovable. Jane Addams came from America, the social reformer who'd founded Hull House. She wanted to understand how to help the poor without condescension. Tolstoy told her to stop running settlement houses and go work in a factory. Live with the poor, don't manage them. She left frustrated but thinking. The contradictions kept multiplying. He preached poverty while living on a massive estate. He demanded his followers give up family ties while surrounded by his own children and grandchildren. He insisted on manual labour but spent most of his time writing. Every principle he articulated, his life violated in some way. The family situation deteriorated. His daughters were divided. Some followed his teachings, wore simple dresses, rejected marriage proposals from wealthy suitors. Others sided with their mother, wanting normal lives, resenting their father's experiments with their futures. His sons mostly kept their distance, visiting occasionally, staying neutral in the wars between their parents. Sophia's diaries from this period are painful to read. She loved him still, desperately, but couldn't live with him. The man she'd married at 18, the passionate novelist who'd courted her with such intensity, had disappeared into this religious figure she couldn't reach. She copied his manuscripts, managed his affairs, and felt utterly alone. Some entries describe suicidal thoughts. Others rage against Chertkov. All of them circle back to the same question. How did they end up here? Tolstoy's diaries mirror hers. He felt trapped, guilty, responsible for her unhappiness, but unable to change course. He'd seen the truth, or what he believed was truth, and couldn't unsee it. Going back to comfortable aristocratic life would be a betrayal of everything, but staying meant watching his wife suffer. Another impossible choice. In 1910, things reached a breaking point. Tolstoy was 82, Sophia 66. The issue was his will. Chertkov had convinced him to officially renounce copyright to all his works, including the early novels. This required a legal document. Sophia discovered the plan, went hysterical, threatened suicide, searched the house for the hidden papers. Tolstoy, trapped between his wife and his disciple, felt his life closing in. He made a decision. On October 28, 1910, at 4 a.m, he woke his daughter Alexandra, the only child still fully loyal to him. They were leaving. He packed a small bag, wrote a letter to Sophia, and walked out into the cold darkness. His doctor, Dusan Makovitsky, joined them. They took a carriage to the train station, bought tickets and left. No destination planned, just away. Tolstoy was fleeing his own life. They travelled south, stopping at his sister's convent first. She was a nun now, his sister Maria, living the renunciation he'd only preached about. He stayed briefly, then moved on. They reached Ostapovo, a tiny railway station in the middle of nowhere. By then, Tolstoy was sick. The cold journey, the stress, his age, all of it caught up at once. He developed pneumonia. The station master, a man named Ozolin, offered his small house. They laid Tolstoy in a cramped bedroom, barely large enough for the bed and 2 chairs. Word spread immediately. The great writer was dying in a railway station. Reporters descended. Photographers. His family arrived, including Sophia, who was kept outside initially. Tolstoy had said he didn't want to see her. Alexandra enforced it. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness. Doctors came from Moscow, though there was little they could do. Pneumonia in an 82-year-old man, already weakened, in a cold room at a rural station. The outcome was obvious. The world watched. Newspapers ran daily updates. Crowds gathered outside the small house. The Holy Synod sent a representative, offering last rites if Tolstoy would reconcile with the church. He refused, or couldn't respond, depending on which account you believe. Either way, no reconciliation happened. On November 7th, early morning, he woke briefly. His daughter Alexandra was there. He said something about escape, about how the truth is then couldn't finish. Those were his last coherent words. The truth is, incomplete, left hanging. He died at 6:05 a.m. The official cause was pneumonia, but everyone understood. He'd died fleeing, trying to escape the contradictions of his life. The man who'd written that death was natural, and nothing to fear, had died in a stranger's house, separated from his wife, surrounded by chaos. The funeral was massive. Thousands came to Yasnaya Polyana, peasants and aristocrats and students. They walked behind the coffin through the forest to the burial spot he'd chosen years earlier. The place where his brother had told him the green stick was buried, the stick with the secret of universal happiness. No priest, no church service, just people following a simple wooden coffin through autumn trees. They buried him on the edge of the forest in a clearing. No cross, no headstone, nothing. Just the earth mounded over him. Exactly as he'd wanted, though the modesty was itself a kind of statement. Even his grave was a sermon. Sophia outlived him by 9 years. She never recovered. She stayed at Yasnaya Polyana, preserving everything, turning the house into a museum. Visitors came to see where the great man had lived and worked. She'd show them his study, his books, tell stories about their life together. The difficult parts she kept private. She died in 1919 during the revolution, having watched the world her husband predicted start to collapse around her. Chertkov survived too initially. He took control of Tolstoy's unpublished works, edited his diaries before releasing them, shaped the legacy according to his vision. The Soviet government eventually turned against him. He'd been useful when they needed to attack the church and the old aristocracy, but once they consolidated power, they didn't need Tolstoyan anarchism complicating things. He died in 1936, forgotten. The estate survived. Through the revolution, through World War II when German troops occupied it briefly, through Soviet bureaucracy and post-Soviet chaos. It's a museum now, a national monument. Tourists walk through the rooms where war and peace was written. They see the simple furniture Tolstoy made, the peasant shirt he wore, the desk where he sat for hours. Everything preserved, nothing resolved, because that's what Tolstoy left behind. Not answers, but a massive, sprawling demonstration of the impossibility of living perfectly in an imperfect world. He tried harder than almost anyone to align his life with his principles, and the result was suffering for everyone around him and ultimately flight. But he tried. That counts for something. His last question hangs in the air still. The truth is what? What was he about to say? Maybe nothing profound. Maybe just delirium. Or maybe he was finally going to reconcile everything. Explain how it all fit together. The art and the morality, the family and the principles, the contradictions he'd lived with for 3 decades. We'll never know. The sentence breaks off unfinished, like his life. Like all our lives, probably. We spend years trying to figure out the truth, and then we run out of time before we can finish the thought. The funeral procession that followed Tolstoy's coffin through the forest was extraordinary for what it represented. No government officials attended, no military honours. The Orthodox Church refused to participate, still furious about his excommunication. What showed up instead were thousands of ordinary people, peasants who'd worked his land, students who'd read his pamphlets, workers from nearby factories, villagers who'd never met him but felt they knew him through his books. They walked in silence behind a simple wooden box, following it to an unmarked grave. This was exactly the legacy he'd wanted, and exactly what made him dangerous. Because Tolstoy's death didn't end Tolstoyanism. If anything, it crystallized it. The contradictions of his life, all the hypocrisy and failure, suddenly mattered less than the fact that he'd tried. He became a martyr for a cause that had no organization, no hierarchy, no official doctrine, just the idea that people should live simply, refuse violence, reject authority, and try to be good. The Tsarist government watched nervously as thousands gathered to mourn. They'd been monitoring Tolstoy for decades, reading his mail, tracking his visitors, censoring his publications. They'd never arrested him because he was too famous, too internationally protected. But they understood the threat. His ideas about non-violence and civil disobedience, his criticism of private property and state power, his insistence that peasants were morally superior to aristocrats. All of it was destabilizing. Within months of his death, Tolstoy's writings were circulating more widely than ever. The government had suppressed most of his later work, the religious and political tracts. Now they flooded the underground press. Students copied them by hand. Workers read them aloud in secret meetings. His critique of the church resonated with people exhausted by institutional corruption. His pacifism appealed to young men facing conscription into an army everyone knew was incompetent and brutal. And his timing was perfect. Russia was heading toward collapse. The 1905 revolution had been suppressed, but the underlying problems remained. Massive inequality, political repression, a backward economy trying to compete with industrialized Europe. Tolstoy had diagnosed all of it in his essays and stories. He'd predicted that violence would eventually answer violence, that injustice would breed revolution. He just hadn't lived to see it. Lenin read Tolstoy, not with admiration but with attention. He wrote several essays analyzing what he called the contradictions of Tolstoyanism. Lenin acknowledged Tolstoy's genius as an artist and his moral authority as a critic of the old order, but he dismissed the non-violence as naive, the religious mysticism as superstition, the agrarian romanticism as backward-looking. Tolstoy, Lenin argued, represented the old patriarchal peasant Russia that was dying. He could diagnose the disease but not cure it. Only revolution could do that. Still, Lenin understood Tolstoy's usefulness, the moral weight, the international reputation, the devastating critique of Orthodox Christianity and aristocratic privilege. All of that could be mobilized, so when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, they made Tolstoy's estate at Yasnaya Polyana a protected site. They published his works widely, especially the ones attacking the church and the wealthy. They positioned him as a prophet of the revolution, conveniently ignoring his anarchism and pacifism. The irony was brutal. Tolstoy, who'd opposed all governments, became a symbol claimed by one of the most authoritarian states in history. His face appeared on propaganda posters. His birthday became a national holiday. Schoolchildren memorized passages from his novels. The Soviet Union built an entire literary establishment around him, calling him the greatest Russian writer, using his reputation to legitimize their cultural project. But they censored the parts that didn't fit. The religious writings largely disappeared. The essays on non-violence were buried. The critique of state power was reframed as critique of capitalist and czarist power only. They turned him into a revolutionary hero by carefully editing out everything revolutionary about his actual beliefs. Meanwhile, outside Russia, Tolstoy's influence spread in directions he'd actually intended. Gandhi had been reading Tolstoy since the early 1900s. They'd corresponded briefly before Tolstoy's death. Letters about non-violence and resistance. Gandhi called Tolstoy his teacher, said that the kingdom of God is within you, had convinced him that non-violent resistance wasn't just moral, but practical. When Gandhi developed his philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, he was building directly on Tolstoyan foundations. Civil disobedience, refusal to cooperate with unjust systems, willingness to suffer rather than inflict suffering. All of it traced back to the ideas Tolstoy had been developing in those late essays. The Salt March in 1930, where Gandhi led thousands in peaceful violation of British law, was Tolstoyan politics in action. The British didn't know how to respond. You can suppress a violent rebellion. You can arrest armed revolutionaries. But what do you do with thousands of people calmly breaking the law, accepting arrest without resistance, turning punishment into moral theatre? Tolstoy had predicted this. He'd argued that governments depend on compliance, that their power evaporates when people simply refuse to participate. Gandhi proved it worked. Martin Luther King Jr. read both Tolstoy and Gandhi while studying theology. The connections were explicit. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance drew heavily on Tolstoy's Christian anarchism, filtered through Gandhi's practical application. The Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, the March on Washington. All of it echoed tactics Tolstoy had theorized and Gandhi had implemented. King even used Tolstoyan language, talking about redemptive suffering, about loving your enemies, about the power of moral witness. The civil rights movement became the fullest expression of Tolstoyan politics in the 20th century. Ordinary people, with no weapons, facing down systemic injustice through collective refusal and moral courage. It was exactly what Tolstoy had imagined, right down to the arrests and beatings that exposed the violence of the state. But Tolstoy's literary legacy followed a different path, one that had nothing to do with politics. For decades after his death, critics argued about how to read him. The Soviets insisted he was primarily a social realist, a writer who exposed class oppression and aristocratic decadence. Western critics focused on the psychological depth, the spiritual searching, the philosophical complexity. Everyone agreed he was a genius, but they couldn't agree what kind. Virginia Woolf called him the greatest of all novelists. She said reading Tolstoy was like having the roof taken off the world, suddenly seeing everything at once with impossible clarity. Thomas Mann argued that War and Peace was the ultimate novel, that nothing written before or after matched its scope and humanity. James Joyce was less impressed, found Tolstoy's moralizing tedious, but even Joyce admitted the technical mastery was undeniable. The comparison with Dostoevsky became inevitable and tiresome. Both Russian, both writing in the same period, both creating massive psychological novels. But the temperaments were opposite. Dostoevsky was fevered, obsessive, diving into the darkest corners of human consciousness. Tolstoy was expansive, clear-eyed, convinced that life could be understood through careful observation. Dostoevsky asked whether God existed. Tolstoy assumed God existed and asked what that required of us. Readers split along predictable lines. Those drawn to darkness and psychological extremity preferred Dostoevsky. Those seeking moral clarity and faith in human goodness preferred Tolstoy. Neither camp was entirely wrong, but the binary missed something important. They were both wrestling with the same crisis, the collapse of religious certainty in the modern world. They just responded differently. Tolstoy's influence on later writers was massive but subtle. He didn't create a school or a style that others could imitate. His technique was too personal, too dependent on his specific vision. But the ambition he represented, the idea that a novel could contain everything, examine every level of human experience from the intimate to the historical, that became the standard. Proust read Tolstoy obsessively. The way Tolstoy moved between individual consciousness and social panorama, the way he made time feel both immediate and vast. These techniques shaped In Search of Lost Time. Hemingway claimed he learned more from Tolstoy than from any other writer, though Hemingway's sparse style seems like a reaction against Tolstoyan expansiveness. Maybe that's the point. You learn from Tolstoy by figuring out what you need to do differently. The 20th century produced countless massive novels trying to capture the sweep of history through individual lives. Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, Lampedusa's The Leopard, Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, Rushdie's Midnight's Children. All of them exist in Tolstoy's shadow, attempting what he'd accomplished, trying to balance the intimate and the epic, the personal and the political. But none match the combination he'd achieved, that weird alchemy where you're reading about Napoleon's invasion of Russia and simultaneously inside Natasha's head during a ball, where military strategy and romantic longing occupy the same emotional space. He'd figured out how to make history feel personal and personal life feel historical. It's a trick that still seems impossible, even after watching him do it. By mid-century, Tolstoy's reputation had stabilized into something universal and unthreatening. He was a classic, which meant everyone respected him, and fewer people actually read him. War and Peace became the novel you were supposed to read, which paradoxically made it easier not to. Anna Karenina remained more popular, the length less intimidating, the story more contained. But something changed in the 1960s and 70s. Student movements, anti-war protests, communes, back-to-the-land experiments. Suddenly Tolstoy's late-life radicalism felt relevant again. Young people rediscovered the kingdom of God is within you, found it speaking directly to their distrust of authority and institutions. Pacifist groups reprinted his essays on nonviolence. Communes studied his agricultural writings, trying to recreate the simple peasant life he'd romanticized. The revival didn't last. Most communes collapsed within a few years. The radical energy of the 60s dissipated into cynicism or was absorbed into mainstream culture. But for a moment, Tolstoy's vision of Christian anarchism, voluntary poverty, and rejection of state violence seemed like a viable alternative, not just a historical curiosity. Academic study of Tolstoy became increasingly sophisticated. Scholars analysed his narrative techniques, his use of free indirect discourse, his management of multiple plot lines. They examined his philosophical development, tracing the evolution from early works to late. They debated endlessly whether the late religious writings diminished or enhanced his literary reputation. The consensus emerged that you could separate them. The novels were masterpieces. The religious tracts were interesting primarily as context for understanding the man. This division would have infuriated Tolstoy, who insisted his late work was more important precisely because it addressed how to live, rather than just how to observe life. But he was dead, and the scholars decided what mattered. Feminist critics began reassessing his female characters. Anna Karenina became a touchstone for discussions of how 19th century literature depicted women trapped by social convention. Was Tolstoy sympathetic to her plight, or ultimately condemning her for violating patriarchal norms? The novel supported both readings, which meant the arguments never resolved. Natasha in War and Peace generated similar debates. She's vibrant and alive in the early sections, then ends the novel as a frumpy mother consumed by domestic concerns. Was this Tolstoy celebrating traditional femininity or showing how society crushes female vitality? Probably both. His attitudes toward women were complex and contradictory, like everything else about him. By the late 20th century, Tolstoy existed in multiple versions simultaneously. The literary genius, universally acknowledged. The moral philosopher, respected but considered impractical. The political radical, claimed by various movements. The religious thinker, largely forgotten outside orthodox circles. The biographical figure, endlessly fascinating for his contradictions. Each version had its advocates and its uses. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and suddenly Tolstoy needed reinterpretation again. He was no longer a state-approved revolutionary hero. The carefully constructed Soviet version of his legacy dissolved. Russians started reading the religious writings that had been suppressed, rediscovering the anarchist and pacifist dimensions that didn't fit the Bolshevik narrative. Yasnaya Polyana remained a pilgrimage site, but the meaning shifted. During Soviet times, people visited to honor a great Russian writer and revolutionary. After the collapse, they came seeking something else. Spiritual guidance, maybe, or connection to a pre-revolutionary past, or just the simple fact of the place where those books were written. The estate itself hadn't changed much. The house, the gardens, the forest paths, everything preserved as it was when Tolstoy lived there. But the country around it had transformed completely, twice over. First the revolution he'd predicted, then the collapse of what that revolution built. And through all of it, the books remained, saying the same things they'd always said, meaning something different to each generation. The question of what Tolstoy actually believed remained surprisingly contested. Not about the big things. He was definitely a Christian, anarchist pacifist who rejected private property and state violence. But the details get murky when you examine them closely. Take nonviolence. Tolstoy insisted it was absolute, no exceptions, no compromises. Yet in his fiction, he created characters like Pierre who participate in war and remain sympathetic. He wrote battle scenes with such visceral immediacy that readers came away thrilled by combat, exactly the opposite reaction he claimed to want. His own sons served in the military despite his objections. When pressed on these contradictions, Tolstoy would say the novels were written before his conversion, that he'd been blind then. But he never stopped people from reading them, never tried to suppress war and peace. He wanted it both ways. His views on sex were even more tangled. The Kreutzer Sonata argues that all sexual desire is evil, even within marriage. Procreation is regrettable but necessary. The ideal would be universal celibacy leading to human extinction, which would be fine because this world is corrupt anyway. He actually wrote that. Then he'd go home to Sophia, who was still bearing his children into her 40s. The hypocrisy was glaring and everyone noticed. Sophia certainly did. She pointed out repeatedly that he preached abstinence while continuing to demand his marital rights. His response was essentially that he was weak, that he failed to live up to his own ideals, but that didn't make the ideals wrong. This was true as far as it went, but it made him insufferable to live with. The property question was similarly complex. He wanted to give away Yasnaya Polyana and all his possessions. Sophia refused, pointing out that she and their younger children would be destitute. Tolstoy's solution was to renounce copyright on everything he wrote after his conversion, making those works public domain. Anyone could publish them and keep the profits. This was genuinely radical. He was forfeiting enormous sums, but he kept the copyright on the early works, the novels, which meant the family still had income. He could claim moral purity while maintaining financial security. The contradiction gnawed at him constantly, but he never fully resolved it. His followers tried to be more consistent. The Tolstoyans who established communes actually gave up everything, lived in voluntary poverty, refused military service even when it meant prison. They took the teachings literally, while Tolstoy himself made accommodations. This created a strange dynamic where the master was less extreme than his disciples. Some of them judged him for it. Others understood that purity is easier when you're young and unencumbered. Tolstoy had decades of prior commitments, a family and estate, a reputation. Walking away completely would have meant abandoning people who depended on him. So he split the difference and satisfied no one, least of all himself. His relationship with the Orthodox Church ended in formal excommunication, but started as something more ambiguous. Tolstoy attended church regularly as a young man, observed fasts, took communion. His crisis of faith in the late 1870s wasn't a sudden break, but a gradual realization that he didn't believe what the church taught. The divinity of Christ, the resurrection, the sacraments, none of it made sense to him anymore. What remained was the ethical teaching. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, don't resist evil with violence. That felt true and urgent. Everything else seemed like institutional accretion, obscuring the simple, radical message. When he published his religious writings spelling this out, the church responded with increasing hostility. They banned his books, pressured publishers, eventually excommunicated him in 1901. The formal decree accused him of heresy and attempting to destroy the foundations of Orthodox Christianity. It was meant to isolate him, to mark him as outside the community of believers. Instead, it made him a martyr. Thousands of people wrote letters of support. Students demonstrated. The excommunication became one of his most famous attributes, proof that he'd been willing to sacrifice everything for truth. But here's the thing. Tolstoy wanted to remain Christian. He insisted his interpretation was the true Christianity, that the church had betrayed Christ's teaching. He wasn't rejecting the faith, he was trying to save it from the institution that had corrupted it. The church disagreed. They said you can't deny the divinity of Christ and call yourself Christian. It's not negotiable. Tolstoy thought it was. The argument was ultimately about who gets to define the religion. Tolstoy said the individual conscience guided by the Gospels. The church said the institutional authority guided by tradition and theology. Neither would compromise. His actual theology was cobbled together from various sources. The Gospels obviously, especially the Sermon on the Mount, but also Buddhism, which he studied seriously and found compatible in many ways, Confucianism, Stoicism, various mystical traditions. He cherry-picked what resonated and discarded the rest. The result was coherent in its ethics, but theologically thin. He had no metaphysics to speak of. The afterlife was vague. God was mostly a principle of goodness, rather than a person. Prayer was meditation on moral truth, rather than communication with a divine being. It worked for him, but wasn't really a system anyone else could adopt wholesale. The writing from this period has aged unevenly. Some essays remain powerful. The kingdom of God is within you still gets read, still influences pacifist movements. What is art is historically important, even though its conclusions seem absurd now. But a lot of it is unreadable. Long polemical tracts against things nobody remembers. Refutations of theological positions that were obscure even then. He was responding to specific controversies in Russian church politics that meant everything in 1895 and nothing by 1920. The shelf life of polemic is short. His last novel, Resurrection, tried to combine the old literary power with the new religious message. It tells the story of a nobleman who seduces a servant girl, ruins her life, then years later encounters her on trial for prostitution and murder. Guilt drives him to attempt redemption, following her to Siberia, trying to help. It's heavy-handed. The message overwhelms the story. Characters exist to illustrate points rather than living as themselves. Contemporary reviews were respectful but unenthusiastic. Everyone could see it wasn't Anna Karenina, but it sold enormously well anyway, because Tolstoy's name guaranteed an audience. He donated all the proceeds to help the Doukhobors, a persecuted religious sect, emigrate to Canada. It was the last major literary work he published. The final decade of his life was consumed by his relationship with Chertkov, his most devoted follower and worst influence. Vladimir Chertkov was wealthy, fanatical, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. He appointed himself guardian of Tolstoy's legacy, managing publications, controlling access, pushing the master toward ever more extreme positions. Sophia hated him with impressive intensity. She saw correctly that Chertkov was manipulating her husband, isolating him from family, using him for the movement's benefit rather than his own well-being. The triangle of Tolstoy, Sophia, and Chertkov dominated the household. Every decision became a power struggle. Chertkov convinced Tolstoy to write a new will, leaving his unpublished manuscripts and literary rights to him rather than the family. They did this secretly. When Sophia found out, the explosion was spectacular. She threatened suicide, raged through the house, demanded the will be changed. Tolstoy was caught between his wife, of nearly 50 years, and the disciple who represented everything he claimed to believe. He made the will, but couldn't tell her. She knew something was wrong, but couldn't prove it. The tension became unbearable. The final crisis came in October 1910. Tolstoy was 82, exhausted, unable to sleep. Sophia's behaviour had become increasingly erratic. She searched his study at night, looking for the will. She confronted Chertkov with accusations. The household was chaos. On October 28th, Tolstoy woke at 3 in the morning to find Sophia rummaging through his papers again. Something snapped. He couldn't live like this anymore. He woke his daughter Alexandra, told her to pack essentials, and left. Just walked out of Yasnaya Polyana in the middle of the night, taking a train with no clear destination. He was fleeing, but also didn't know where to go. His sister lived in a convent. He went there first, then changed his mind, got on another train heading south. He was travelling with Alexandra and his doctor. They had almost no plan. He wanted to disappear, to live out his remaining time in peace somewhere anonymous. It was a fantasy. He was the most famous man in Russia. People recognized him at every station. On November 1st, he fell ill on the train. Fever, weakness. They got off at a small station called Astapovo and took him to the station master's house. It was pneumonia. At 82, it was likely fatal. News spread immediately. Journalists descended on Astapovo. Family members arrived. Sophia came but was initially barred from seeing him. Chertkov was there managing access, controlling the narrative. The death watch became a media circus. Reporters camped outside. Photographers waited. The station master's tiny house contained one of history's great writers dying while the world watched. He drifted in and out of consciousness for a week, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. He asked for peasants to be brought in so he could talk to them. He dictated fragments. Mostly he was too weak. Sophia was finally allowed in on November 7th, but he was unconscious by then. He died early morning on November 7th, 1910, without regaining consciousness, without reconciling with his wife, without resolving any of the contradictions that had defined his final years. The funeral was enormous. Thousands of people came to Yasnaya Polyana. The government was nervous. They'd considered arresting Tolstoy multiple times for sedition, but his fame protected him. Now he was dead, and they worried about demonstrations. Police monitored the crowds. Nothing happened. People just came to pay respects. He was buried in the forest on the estate where he'd played as a child, at the spot where his brother had supposedly hidden a green stick with the secret to universal happiness. No cross marked the grave, just a mound of earth. It seemed appropriate for someone who'd rejected all ceremony. The fight over his legacy started immediately. Chertkov claimed authority over the unpublished works. Sophia challenged the will in court. The legal battle dragged on for years, became vicious, consumed everyone involved. Alexandra sided with Chertkov. Most of the other children sided with Sophia. The family that Tolstoy had tormented with his impossible ideals now tore itself apart over his papers. What they were fighting over was the right to define what Tolstoy meant. Chertkov wanted to emphasize the religious and political writings, to present Tolstoy primarily as a moral teacher. Sophia wanted to protect the literary legacy, to ensure the novels remained central. Both had commercial interests too. The copyrights were valuable, but it was also genuinely about interpretation. Tolstoy had been so many things. Which version would history remember? The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 made the whole dispute moot in some ways. The Soviet state nationalized everything eventually, took control of publications, decided what got printed, but it didn't end the argument about who Tolstoy was. Lenin had called him the mirror of the Russian Revolution. Stalin kept his works in print. The state needed him as a symbol, even while suppressing the religious and anarchist dimensions that made him dangerous. Outside Russia, translation and publication continued without political interference. English editions of the novels became standard. They were taught in universities, analysed in critical studies, adapted for stage and screen. War and Peace got made into films multiple times. Anna Karenina became a favourite of directors who wanted to showcase their leading ladies. The stories were universal enough to survive transplantation. The novels lived on. But the question remained, what about the rest? What about the religious writings, the political essays, the late stories where Tolstoy tried to write simply for peasants? These were harder to digest, easier to ignore. Critics focused on the masterpieces of the 1860s and 70s, treated everything after as decline, as the unfortunate period when a great artist lost his way. This interpretation became standard. Tolstoy the novelist was a genius. Tolstoy the prophet was a crank. Separate the art from the ideology, appreciate the former, politely set aside the latter. It's a convenient reading, but it misses something essential. The religious crisis wasn't a break from his earlier work. It was the culmination of questions present from the beginning. Pierre's search for meaning in War and Peace, Levin's spiritual struggle in Anna Karenina, these weren't detours from the plot. They were the plot, or at least as important as any romance or battle. The late Tolstoy, who rejected violence and property and institutional religion, was answering questions the young Tolstoy had posed in his fiction. You can't fully understand the novels without the later work. They explain each other, but the division persists. Literary scholars study the novels, religious historians examine the tracts, political theorists cite the anarchist writings. Everyone takes a piece. Nobody quite knows what to do with the whole. Gandhi knew. When he read "The Kingdom of God is Within You" in South Africa, it changed his life. He'd been searching for a method of resistance that didn't require violence. Tolstoy gave him one. Civil disobedience, non-cooperation, moral resistance. Gandhi applied these principles in his campaigns, first in South Africa, then in India. The two men corresponded in Tolstoy's final year. Gandhi sent respectful letters calling him a teacher. Tolstoy replied encouragingly, said he saw the future in Gandhi's work. When Gandhi led the Salt March decades later, walking to the sea to make salt, in defiance of British law, he was enacting Tolstoyan principles: peaceful resistance, refusal to cooperate with injustice, willingness to suffer rather than inflict suffering. It worked. The British Empire, which had conquered half the world through superior firepower, couldn't figure out how to respond to a man making salt. Martin Luther King Jr. read Gandhi and through Gandhi discovered Tolstoy. The connection is direct. King's philosophy of nonviolence, the strategy that dismantled legal segregation in America, traces back through Gandhi to a Russian aristocrat who decided violence was always wrong. The civil rights movement sang hymns and marched unarmed into police dogs and fire hoses because Tolstoy had convinced Gandhi, who convinced King, that this was the only moral path. Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic worker movement, kept Tolstoy's books on her shelf. She'd been arrested dozens of times for protesting war and serving the poor. She ran hospitality houses where homeless people could stay and eat. She refused to pay taxes that funded weapons. All Tolstoyan, the Catholic Church eventually declared her venerable first step towards sainthood, which would have amused Tolstoy, who'd been excommunicated by the Orthodox Church for similar activities. Cesar Chavez organising farm workers, Daniel Berrigan pouring blood on draft files. The entire tradition of Christian anarchism and pacifism in the 20th century carries Tolstoy's fingerprints. These weren't literary admirers, they were practitioners implementing his program. Yet in Russia itself, the religious writings were suppressed for 70 years. The Soviet state published the novels as classics of critical realism, but banned the religious and political works as ideologically harmful. You could read about Pierre and Natasha, but not about the kingdom of God. The state needed Tolstoy's prestige, but feared his actual ideas. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a brief revival of interest. Some Russians rediscovered the religious writings, saw them as offering an alternative moral framework after decades of official atheism. But it didn't last. The Orthodox Church, restored to prominence, remembered that Tolstoy had rejected them. Nationalists disliked his pacifism and criticism of patriotism. He remained too radical, too uncomfortable. In the West, Tolstoy's political influence faded. Gandhi and King were studied as historical figures, but their Tolstoyan roots were often footnoted, treated as interesting background rather than essential foundation. Pacifism fell out of fashion. Nonviolence seemed naive. The 20th century's wars were too vast, the enemies too monstrous. How do you practice non-resistance against fascism? Tolstoy's answer that violence always creates more violence, that you cannot bomb people into virtue, that meeting evil with evil only multiplies it. This sounded impractical, maybe beautiful, maybe admirable, but not useful. The novels, though, the novels endured without controversy. War and Peace remained on every list of the greatest books ever written. Anna Karenina competed with it for the title of best novel in any language. New translations appeared every few decades. Scholars wrote dissertations. Readers kept discovering them. A teenager in Ohio opens War and Peace expecting a boring classic and finds herself unable to stop reading about Natasha's first ball. A graduate student in Tokyo writes about the structure of Anna Karenina. A book club in London spends 6 months working through War and Peace, meeting weekly to discuss 50 pages at a time. They argue about whether Pierre should have married Natasha, whether Napoleon was a great man or a puppet of history, whether Tolstoy's philosophy of history makes any sense. The books generate endless discussion because they're inexhaustible. Every reading reveals something new. The detail is overwhelming. Tolstoy describes a Moscow ballroom so completely you can see the candles reflecting off the parquet floor. He gets inside a hunting dog's mind during a chase. He shows you how sunlight falls on grass. Critics sometimes called this excessive, but readers loved it. The world of the novels feels more real than reality. You finish War and Peace and contemporary life seems thin by comparison. Film directors kept trying to capture this. Sergei Bondarchuk's 1966 Soviet version of War and Peace took 7 years to make, cost more than any film in history at that point, used thousands of Red Army soldiers as extras for the battle scenes. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. It's visually spectacular. But even at over 7 hours, it can't include everything. The novel is too big. Andrew Davies adapted it for BBC in 2016. Joe Wright directed the best-known version of Anna Karenina in 2012, staging much of it as if the characters were performers in a theatre. Each adaptation makes choices, emphasises certain elements, loses others. None fully succeeds because the novels resist compression. They require time. You can't rush War and Peace. Trying to read it quickly means missing most of what matters. The experience is in the accumulation, the slow immersion in another world. Modern readers sometimes struggle with this. We're trained for speed, for quick consumption. Tolstoy demands patience. Put your phone away. Sit with it. Let the 19th century settle around you. The reward is proportional to the investment. His influence on other writers is incalculable. Every novelist working in the realist tradition is in some sense writing in Tolstoy's shadow. The attention to social detail, the psychological depth, the moral seriousness, these became standard because Tolstoy demonstrated what was possible. Virginia Woolf called him the greatest of all novelists. James Joyce kept a portrait of him on his wall. Thomas Mann considered him an unsurpassable master. Even writers who worked in completely different modes acknowledged the benchmark. Nabokov, who disliked most Russian literature and made a sport of mocking Dostoevsky, admitted grudgingly that Tolstoy was a genius. The highest praise Nabokov could give, contemporary writers still cite him. When asked about influences, literary novelists drop Tolstoy's name reflexively. Sometimes it's genuine, sometimes it's aspirational, claiming kinship with greatness. But the fact that his name carries that weight a century after his death says something. There's an argument that Tolstoy represents the peak of a certain kind of novel, the 19th century realist masterpiece that tries to capture an entire society in encyclopedic detail. After modernism, after postmodernism, after the novel fragmented into 1,000 experimental forms, nobody writes like that anymore. Nobody tries to write war and peace now. The ambition seems quaint. We're more skeptical about grand narratives, more aware that any attempt to represent reality is partial and constructed. Tolstoy believed he could show the truth. We're not so sure truth is available, but maybe that's why the novels still matter. They come from a moment when it seemed possible to know, to understand, to represent the world completely. That confidence is lost now. Reading Tolstoy lets us visit it, remember what it felt like to believe that art could capture everything. There's nostalgia in that, but also something necessary. We need to remember that ambition, even if we can't replicate it. His personal life remains troubling. No amount of literary genius excuses the way he treated Sophia. The diaries she kept, published after both their deaths, are devastating. She describes the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, the exhaustion of managing the household and raising children while he pursued his spiritual experiments. She copied his manuscripts, managed his correspondence, kept the estate running. He acknowledged none of it, treated her work as insignificant compared to his. When she complained, he called her materialistic, spiritually blind. It's a pattern recognizable to anyone who's encountered a certain type of idealistic man. He loves humanity in the abstract but can't see the actual human beings around him. He preaches universal love while neglecting his family. He demands that others sacrifice while protecting his own comfort. Sophia saw through it. Her tragedy was that seeing through it didn't free her. She loved him anyway, needed his approval, kept trying to reach him. He remained unreachable, locked inside his own head. The children suffered differently. Some, like Alexandra, embraced the cause and spent their lives promoting Tolstoyan principles. Others, like Sergei, rejected it all and lived conventional lives. Several struggled with mental illness. Suicide and early death marked the family. The pressure of being Tolstoy's child, of growing up in that atmosphere of impossible ideals and constant moral judgment, damaged them in ways that became clear only later. This matters because Tolstoy's philosophy was supposed to make people better. If it made his own family miserable, what does that tell us? Maybe that the gap between theory and practice is always wider than idealists want to admit. Maybe that moral perfectionism is a form of cruelty. Maybe that you can't transcend human nature through willpower alone. Tolstoy kept trying anyway, right up to the end. That's either admirable or pathological, depending on your perspective. Probably both. His grave at Yasnaya Polyana is still there. No monument, just a mound of earth in the forest. Visitors come, leave flowers, stand quietly. It's become a pilgrimage site, though Tolstoy would have hated that word. The estate is a museum now. You can tour the house, see his study, walk the grounds. It's preserved as it was, a snapshot of 1910. Tourists take photographs, students write papers. The Russian government maintains it as cultural heritage. Every year on his birthday, people gather to celebrate. There are readings, discussions, concerts. The Orthodox Church sends representatives now, a reconciliation of sorts. The excommunication was never formally lifted, but everyone pretends it doesn't matter anymore. He's been safely historical for long enough that even the Church can claim him. What would he think of all this? The attention, the preservation, the academic industry built around his work. He'd probably find it absurd. He wanted to be forgotten, wanted his works to enter the public domain immediately, wanted no monuments or memorials. He got the opposite. But maybe that's appropriate. His whole life was a contradiction between what he preached and what he was. Why should his death be different? The question he asked remains unanswered. How should we live? He tried every answer he could think of. Pleasure, duty, art, religion, simplicity, renunciation. None of them worked completely. He died confused and alone at a railway station, still searching. That might be his most honest legacy. Not the answers he thought he'd found, but the demonstration that the question is harder than it looks. That you can be brilliant and sincere and dedicated and still not figure it out. That the examined life doesn't necessarily lead to clarity. We keep reading him because the search matters more than the destination. Because his failures are more instructive than most people's successes. Because the novels contain more wisdom than the philosophy, precisely because they don't claim to have solutions. War and Peace doesn't tell you how to live. It shows you life in all its complexity and lets you draw your own conclusions. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. The thing about Tolstoy is that we keep expecting a resolution that never comes. We want the story to end with him figuring it out, achieving the synthesis, reconciling the contradictions. But that's not what happened. He died at a railway station, fleeing his own life, and the mess he left behind took decades to sort through. What survived isn't what he thought would matter. The religious tracts he considered his most important work, mostly forgotten outside specialist circles. The novels he later dismissed as worthless. They're what made him immortal. The aristocratic estate he wanted to renounce. It's a museum now, preserved in amber. Tourists walking through rooms where he agonized over questions they'll never have to face. But here's what's strange. The failure might be the point. Not failure in the sense that he accomplished nothing. He wrote 2 of the greatest novels in any language. He influenced Gandhi, who influenced King, who changed history. His ideas about nonviolence and civil disobedience reshaped political resistance for a century. That's not nothing. The failure is that he never resolved the contradiction between how he thought life should be lived and how it actually gets lived, between the ideal and the possible, between what we know is right and what we're capable of doing. He spent 30 years trying to close that gap through sheer force of will, and it destroyed his family and nearly destroyed him. Yet thousands of people still visit that unmarked grave every year. They're not coming to pay respects to a successful moral philosopher who figured everything out. They're coming because he didn't figure it out, because he kept trying anyway, because the struggle itself meant something. The novels endure because they don't pretend to have answers. Pierre wanders through War and Peace searching for meaning, thinks he's found it several times, keeps discovering he was wrong. Levin in Anna Karenina has his spiritual revelation in the final pages, but even that feels tentative, fragile, something that could dissolve by tomorrow. This is honest in a way the late religious writings aren't. The fiction admits that life is complicated and confusing. The philosophy demands simplicity that doesn't exist. Maybe that's why we still read him. Not for solutions, but for the quality of the questioning. Not for the destination, but for watching someone wrestle with the hardest problems human beings face and refuse to settle for easy answers. He could have stayed comfortable, written more novels, enjoyed his fame. Instead, he tore his life apart trying to live according to principles most people don't even bother articulating. That's either noble or insane, probably both, but it's not boring and it's not safe, and it forces you to ask questions about your own life you'd rather avoid. Which is exactly what he did to everyone around him, to everyone who read him, to everyone who encountered his ideas. He made comfort impossible. He made complacency unacceptable. He insisted that if you saw the truth, you had to live it. Consequences be damned. The consequences were brutal. A marriage destroyed, children damaged, a man dying alone in a stranger's house. But also movements started, injustices challenged, millions of people inspired to think differently about violence and property and how we treat each other. Both outcomes came from the same source. You can't separate good Tolstoy from bad Tolstoy, the brilliant novelist from the insufferable moralist, the loving father from the impossible idealist. They're the same person, and the contradictions generated both the beauty and the damage. Accept all of it or none of it, but don't pretend you can take the parts you like and ignore the rest. He won't let you. His last words were, "The truth is," and then nothing. The sentence breaks off incomplete. Maybe he was about to explain everything, tie it all together, deliver the final wisdom that would make sense of the whole confused journey. Or maybe he was just delirious, words failing as the body shut down. We'll never know, but that incomplete sentence feels right somehow. The truth is, what? Still searching, still questioning, still trying to figure out how to live in a world that makes no sense. That was Tolstoy's life, and that's his legacy. Not answers, but better questions. Not solutions, but the refusal to stop looking for them. Not peace, but the restless certainty that peace without justice is worthless, and justice without effort is impossible. The green stick is still buried somewhere in the forest at Yasnaya Polyana, the secret to universal happiness, hidden where his brother said it would be, waiting to be discovered. Tolstoy never found it, neither will we, but something matters about the search itself, about believing the secret exists, about refusing to accept that cruelty and suffering and injustice are just how things are. He was impossible, and brilliant, and maddening, and occasionally transcendent. He wrote books that will outlast everything we build. He developed ideas that changed how millions of people think about violence and resistance and moral obligation. He made his wife miserable, and his children anxious, and his disciples crazy. He died confused and alone, still trying, still failing, still somehow mattering more than people who succeeded at smaller things. That's Tolstoy, all of it. The masterpieces and the mistakes, the wisdom and the cruelty, the soaring ambition and the human wreckage. You don't get one without the other. Accept the whole contradictory mess or walk away, but don't expect resolution. There isn't any. There never was. The truth is,